Good evening, everyone. I grew up in Västergötland, and at the age of 21, I graduated from Lund University, and I thought it was a brilliant idea to buy myself a ticket to Beijing, a single ticket. So it took almost 15 years before I moved back to Sweden, and now live here in Stockholm, and I'm very pleased to be here tonight. Some of the experiences that I had while living abroad, I spent many years in Asia, worked my way through Australia, Germany, and made countless business trips all over the world, from Tel Aviv to Tokyo, and I've come across bribery, passively and actively. I've experienced different types of situations and patterns. And when I then moved back here to Sweden, it struck me that we might have some similarities here, of some practices that we think perhaps only occur in China, for instance. So I decided to write a book about this, and that's why I'm here. Now, did any of you have to pay off a traffic policeman when you passed through the toll gates into a city recently? Okay. Did any of you feel the urge that you needed to offer money under the table to your doctor if you needed medical help in the past few years? Okay. Well, we don't have corruption in Sweden, as you know, or hardly any at all. Or are we really sure about that? Well, I'd like to make a distinction between what I call primitive corruption, something that's really blatant, directly in your face type of corruption that you may find in less developed economies, and what I call social or embedded corruption, that's become integrated in how we interact with each other to the extent that we don't perceive it as corruption. Now, imagine a country where 30% of all companies say they have been exposed to economic crime. And the second most common type of economic crime is said to be bribery. And in this country, 18% of all citizens say, well, I think I know someone who has been bribed. And 50% feel that probably the politicians and officials misuse their positions. We're of course talking about Sweden, and these figures are not that different from what you may find in, say, Slovakia or in China, for instance. At least not if you read the 2013 PwC Global Economic Crime Survey. Well, at the same time, we rank as number 3 among the world's least corrupt countries. So these figures don't really match up. Why not? Well, I'm not suggesting that we are suffering from corruption on comparable levels that you may find in emerging markets. But what I'm saying is that we might be sanctimonious in terms of how we look at the problems that we do indeed have here. So when I decided to write a book about corruption in Sweden, the most frequent comment that I got was, "Are you really sure you want to do this? Do you know what you're getting yourself into?" Well, and also I noticed that when one of the true spokespeople about anti-corruption in this country, the former Auditor General, speaks out in the press about corruption, people turn around and they say, well, you know, she's retired nowadays. She's got nothing more to lose. So what is it that we're afraid of? Well, according to critics, we Swedes see ourselves as morally superior to other people. You know, we're leaders in business ethics and social accountability, and other countries are slightly morally degenerate. So, in my book, I raise 2 questions. Firstly, are we really that morally superior that as we think? And I conclude the answer is no. And the second question is then, why are we sanctimonious about the fact that we're not? It's like kind of a double bookkeeping, if you like. And you might at first be amused when you hear stories about how a local official in Uddevalla managed to spend 30 million krona in public funds, equivalent to 3 million euros, to pay off prostitutes before anyone reacted. And you might also have heard that the director of the state penitentiary is currently under suspicion for accepting bribes in the range of 40 million krona. And in particular, you might be a little bit amused when you hear that the Central Committee for Ethical Vetting, Centrala Etikprövningsnämnden, managed to spend 130,000 krona for a party for 18 people. Now, the more you think about it, you might start feeling a little bit disturbed. And perhaps a few of you have read also in the last few years in the press ongoing stories, large-scale corruption going on in telecom and in forestry, public administration, Solna, Göteborg, Malmö. Well, there are a few places to be mentioned. And the more you dig into these things, you will see that there are plenty of stories like these. Now, did you know that up until 1999, costs for facilitation payments made abroad were tax deductible in Sweden? And did you know that Sweden is one of few countries in the European Union where auditors, who are supposed to check how our local politicians spend taxpayers' money, are not independent? They are selected directly by the politicians themselves. And there are examples, for instance, such as in Motala, a large-scale corruption scandal where the chief auditor was a good friend of the top politicians and happily joined lavish dinners at the local hotel or business trips to the Mediterranean and other relevant places. So there are systemic weaknesses, both in public and in corporate governance. We use business models where we outsource high-risk operations in really corrupt countries to more or less unknown middlemen. And then when something goes wrong, we say, sorry, I didn't know. We were so naive at the time. And we put ourselves in the position of the victims, rather than being responsible about it. Yet, at the same time, we love to dive into the nitty-gritty details, and we keep repeating this mantra of zero tolerance, whereby we must refuse a harmless business dinner, perhaps with potential partners, and at best we may say yes, thank you to a lunch, provided that it's been heated up in a microwave somewhere, is tasteless, and presented on an orange plastic tray. Now, the Swedish speakers in the audience will know I'm talking about the fancy concept of bricklunch. About 100 years ago, there was a bestseller, which I really enjoyed reading. I'm not that old. It was published in 1911. It's called Svenska folklynnet. It's a book about the Swedish mentality. And in this book, we described in a fairly unflattering way, saying that we value being nice above everything else. Man ska vara trevlig. And being nice, that will help you to borrow money from others when needed and currying favors. And it's really important that you stick with your group, should not stand out. Now, this still holds true, because earlier this year, researchers from Lund University contended in a reportage that if you're new on your job, key thing is to blend in. You should be nice to everybody and you should not stand out. You should keep a low profile. And in 2008, we had 10 cases of bribery registered in Sweden. 1 year later, there were 323 cases. I don't think that this is due to a sudden upsurge. Rather, I think it's because more people simply decided to report. And as you will recall, we had in 2008 a financial crisis. A lot of people lost their jobs. So you lose your job, you can allow yourself to break out of the bonds and report on your boss perhaps or colleagues about behavior that you think might be associated with corruption. I would also like to bring to your attention that the last time the prize Whistleblower of the Year was awarded in Sweden was in 2010. This is a prize given by the organization Transparency International. 2 people shared the prize that year. They both lost their jobs. I've interviewed one of them, and apart from losing her work contract, she told me that she was threatened by her colleagues, and she has struggled to find work ever since. In media, she was described as a pretty sad person, a victim, rather than someone who's done something brave. So, in the last 4 years since then, no prize has been awarded. I'm told that the people that have been nominated did not want to go public with their names, or there have been no worthy candidates. Now, I would suggest that this is a pretty poor track record for us. Corruption, as you may know, is a great hindrance to economic development. Certainly so in less developed countries. However, corruption can also grow in tandem with a significant GDP increase. We've seen this in China, for instance. This phenomenon is called a double paradox and has been researched by people at the Georgia State University in the US. Now, I'd like to speculate, I'm not saying it's the case, but perhaps we may have a situation where corruption can also grow in our society. The competition for jobs, for rental contracts, my God, in this city alone, and just to secure business in general is fierce. So you need to use your personal contacts in order to get ahead of others. You might even resort to nepotism. And using a public position for private gain, as you might know, is a definition of corruption. So, talking about the Swedish mentality, contrary to popular belief, our behavioral traits are fairly network-oriented. We have a lot of collectivism, we have flat organizations, and very close relationship between work life and private life. And in our flat organizations, responsibility becomes diffused. And in our spare time, we spend extensive time with our colleagues, playing tennis, socializing, and so on. And this creates a kind of a social stickiness, an awkwardness, and a high-stakes strategy for those who want to break out from the herd. It might also perhaps explain why almost 1 in 5 people say they know someone who has been bribed, whilst the number of registered cases is extremely low. So, by going with the flow, slipping into kind of a monkey see, monkey do role, because we're all competing for the same scarce opportunities, it might be that we condone corruption. And I'm not talking about criminal acts only, I'm talking about a lack of ethical behavior. Behavior that can impact decision making, that impacts transparency, and of course that generates costs for everybody. And this will probably continue to do so long as we value compromise more than we value fairness in all situations. Because these things that I've talked about now, they all together indicate that the potential personal damage of blowing a whistle by far exceeds the potential personal gain. So, to finish off this evening, my talk here, I'd like really to emphasize that Sweden is one of the most advanced, least corrupt countries in the world. But by being sanctimonious about these issues, we miss the opportunity of becoming even better and even more competitive. So, we do know what it is, isn't it, when we see corruption? Don't we? Now, I'd like to leave here with this question for you to think about. Thank you for listening.